I
Right.
couldn't find the button. Okay. Well, first of all, Mr. Burton, I want to personally say thank you for being here this evening. So, I'll introduce you and then we'll start from there. So, Art T. Burton received a BA and an MA in African American Studies from Governor State University. He retired in 2015 after spending 38 years in higher education. He was a history professor at Prairie State College and Southern Suburban College and worked as an administrator in African American student affairs at Benedictine University, Loyola University Chicago, that's a tough word, and Columbia College, Chicago. In 1991, Burton wrote the first book on African American and Native American outlaw and lawmen in the Wild West. It is titled Black, Red, and Deadly: Black and Indian Gunfighters of the Indian Territory, 1870 to 1907. In 1999, Burton wrote the first book on African Americans who were scouts and soldiers in the Wild West. The book is entitled Black, Buckskin, and Blue: African American Scouts and Soldiers on the Western Frontier. In 2007, Burton wrote the first scholarly biography on an African American lawman of the Wild West. This work is titled Black Gun, Silver Star: The Life and Legend of Frontier Marshal Bass Reeves. His most recent work, Cherokee Bill, Black Cowboy, Indian Outlaw, is out now. Some of the honors Mr. Burton has received include being named a territorial marshal by Governor David Walters of Oklahoma in 1995, being inducted into Who's Who in Black Chicago in 2007, being inducted into the Hall of Fame of the National Multicultural Western Heritage Museum in Fort Worth, Texas in 2008, being inducted into Who's Who in America in 2010, and he was given the Living Legend Award by Bare Bones Film Festival in Muskogee, Oklahoma in 2015. Burton has appeared in 4 documentaries for the History Channel on cable television. He was a participant on BET's Teen Summit with Mario Van Peebles for a discussion on the movie Posse. In 2015, Burton appeared on Fox Cable's Legends and Lies series episode titled The Real Lone Ranger, and was a participant in the AHC cable series Gunslingers episode on Bass Reeves. Burton spoke at the B.B. King Symposium at Mississippi Valley State University in the fall of 2018 on African American and Native American cultures. In July 2019, Burton was the keynote speaker at the 10th annual Bass Reeves Western History Conference in Muskogee, Oklahoma. He was recently named the historian for the National Multicultural Western Heritage Museum of Fort Worth, Texas. And congratulations on that, because that is a great position.
Thank you.
He is passionate about the Wild West and continues to bring unsung heroes to light. And so, again, Mr. Burton, thank you so much. And I have 2 of your titles right here in front of me that I
Very
really,
good.
um, and I see that the Cherokee Bill title is a YA.
It's
Is
a
it for
what?
young?
I'm sorry.
The Cherokee Bill, it's listed. I looked it up on Amazon. It says that it's for young adults. Is it like a?
No, that's not true.
Oh, okay.
No, that's not true at all. I haven't wrote a book yet for young people.
Okay. So yeah,
No,
so it must be miscategorized because I was like, oh, cool. Okay, this is for younger kids. But
right.
yeah,
There might be another book out there they're getting confused with.
yeah,
Thank
possibly that
you.
does happen.
Right. I'm very happy to be here with the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery Association for this presentation this evening. Um, yeah, I've been on this road for quite a while, and actually it started when I was a youth because my mother grew up in Oklahoma, was born in Oklahoma, and I used to go to Oklahoma in the summertime to visit relatives, and that was quite an experience because they lived in rural Oklahoma for the most part, and they had cattle and horses, and they rodeoed in the black rodeos in Oklahoma quite a bit.
Hmm.
And it was like going to the land of Oz for me as a little kid. I always wondered what the role of African Americans was in the Western frontier. And initially, I didn't think they had a role because you didn't see them in the movies or in books or anything. But as time goes on, things changed. And actually, I did my last 2 years of high school in Oklahoma, which is on Route 66, which is a small black town, predominantly black town, about 25 miles northeast of Oklahoma City. And we didn't talk too much history while I was there. I was trying to play a little basketball, but I think I was really, it got on my subconscious was the history of African Americans in Oklahoma history. And that stayed on the back of my mind. And it wasn't until I got married many years later, and I traveled to actually the Seminole Nation, Wowoka, when I went to Oklahoma to visit my relatives. And I visited the Seminole Nation Museum, and they had a little bit of history on Black Seminoles, which was informative. And that kind of began my whole trip down memory lane and looking at what was the African American experience on the Western frontier. So this has been quite a journey. I majored in African American studies, got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in African American studies, and most of the books in the genre are about African Americans east of the Mississippi River, not too much west of the Mississippi River when I was in school. And as time went on, there was a black rodeo every Black History Month here in Chicago, and the gentleman used to put the rodeo on and bring school children in, and to show that Blacks had participated in the West. And he had a skit one time where a stagecoach was coming out and it was robbed, and a Black man with a badge came out and saved the folks on the stagecoach. And I told my wife at the time, I said, it's a nice skit, but there's no information, no literature that stated African Americans did anything like this. And I think that was probably another notch in the back of my mind to say, maybe I need to take a look at this history and see what I can find out. So the whole journey really jumped off big time around 1985. And I was in Oklahoma for a family reunion. And we were talking about the lack of African American history that had been documented. And my cousin had a roommate. I was hanging with my cousin, and his roommate was from Muskogee, Oklahoma. And his roommate stated that his former roommate, he stated that he had lived in Muskogee in Reeves Addition, and it was named for a Black lawman named Bass Reeves. And he went on to say this guy had, quite a reputation. And I had never heard of a part of a town named for a lawman, Black or white, period. So I told my cousins to find every older person they could find who knew or heard something about Bass Reeves, and to get back to me with any information they had, phone numbers and such. And then I contacted Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is the closest university to Muskogee. And I asked the research librarian about Reeves Addition, and they told me they would see what they could find and send me any information that was pertinent to my research. And turned off my phone. And so the older people that my cousins found, they started telling me stories that I would call up these older people, and they would say that Bass Reeves would arrest Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, just about any outlaw of note in the Wild West. They said here, and initially I thought these people was a little bit off their rocker, because I'm starting saying, well, if this guy was this famous, everybody would have known about him. And so I got an envelope from the library at Northeastern State University, and the envelope had a map in it, and it had a descriptive information about Reeves Addition. And Reeves Addition was named for a white banker and a developer named Ira Reeves. And although today the majority of the people live in Reeves Addition in Muskogee are African Americans, Reeves Addition has nothing to do with Bass Reeves at all. But people thought it did because, you know, Bass had lived there the last 10 years of his life. So I was, I was about to give up.
I love you, miss you, I'm hungry.
Got a conflict now. Hello, there we go. So I was about ready to give up the ghost in terms of researching Bass Reeves. And then I remembered there was a barber from the north side of Chicago who had moved to Denver, Colorado, and had started a museum in the basement of a black radio station. And it was called the Black West Museum. His name was Mr. Stewart. And by that time, I was just kind of quizzical about was there any African Americans in law enforcement on the Western frontier, and I was interested in wanting to know who Mr. Stewart knew or information he had found out. So I called him up and I asked him, was there any African Americans of note on the Western frontier? And the first thing out of his mouth was Bass Reeves. And I was kind of taken back by that. And he told me he didn't know too much about it, but he said it was two older gentlemen from Oklahoma who lived in Denver. And he said that's all they talked about. And he stated there was one named Reverend Haskell Shoeboot. And he said Reverend Haskell Shoeboot said that Bass would walk the streets of Muskogee with a sidekick who carried a satchel full of pistols. Now, this had been late in Bass's law enforcement career after 1900. And he said if somebody called Bass's name, Bass always put his back up against the wall before he would turn around and see who was calling his name. And so I asked him, did he have any information on where I could talk to Reverend Shoeboot? And he said he actually hadn't seen him in a couple of years. And so I thanked him for that information. So I called up the Denver, Colorado phone operator, and I asked her if she had a listener for Reverend Haskell Shoeboot, and she did. And I dialed the number, and a lady answered the phone. I told her I wanted to speak to Reverend Haskell Shoeboot. And he came on the phone, and he talked almost in a hoarse whisper, like, how you doing? Yes, like that. And I told him I was trying to get some information on Bass Reeves, and he laughed. And I don't know why he laughed, but he laughed. Maybe he was kind of, overjoyed that I was inquiring about Bass. But he went on to say that Bass could outfight, outrope, outride, outshoot, out blah, 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 blah. It was almost similar to things the other people that told me in Oklahoma. And I guess he really wanted to impress on my mind that he knew something about Bass. And he said, I tell you, something I seen with my own eyes. And he told me he drove the hack for Bud Ledbetter. And Bud Ledbetter was one of the top white lawmen in Muskogee, Oklahoma after the turn of the century. And he said that Bud Ledbetter was after an outlaw 12 miles north of Muskogee at a place called Gibson Station. Now, I used to go to Oklahoma as a kid, and I was used to Jim Crow. I even had to eat in the kitchen of a restaurant one time in a little town in Oklahoma. So I was very aware of it. And many of the older people that my cousins had initially told me to get in contact with had told me that Bass was arresting white folks. And that didn't really sit too well with me at the time because I was familiar with Oklahoma and its Jim Crow laws. And so I asked Shoeboot about this outlaw that Bud Ledbetter was after. And he said that Bud had a pretty large posse. And I asked him, was the name of another peace officer in the posse? And he gave me the name, and I did find it was a gentleman who had that name, who was a law enforcement officer. And I asked him, was the outlaw white or black that the posse was after? And he said he was white. And so my antenna kind of went up. I said, okay. So he said that the posse was shooting at this outlaw. And I guess he had done something pretty bad because they were trying to kill him. And he said the outlaw had a pretty good hiding location, and the posse spent the majority of the morning, trying to hit this guy, and they couldn't hit him. And he said Bud Ledbetter got irate because the ammunition they were using was his inventory, and they were going through it pretty quick. And he told somebody in the posse to go back to Muskogee and get Bass Reeves. And he said that Bass came on the scene later in the day. The sun was starting to go down. The posse had quit shooting at this outlaw, and it was pretty quiet. And he said the outlaw jumped up. When he said he jumped up, I thought he was going to say he jumped up and ran for his horse to try to get on his horse. And he said the outlaw started running across this field. Well, that burst my Hollywood bubble right there. So he said the outlaw started running across this field, and he said the posse started shooting at him, and they were missing. And he said that Bud Ledbetter hollered at the top of his voice, "Get him, Bass!" And he said, Bass Reeves said very coolly and calmly, "I will break his neck." And he said Bass took his Winchester rifle, and one shot broke this man's neck at a quarter of a mile. And I had never seen nothing like that in a movie. And so the first thing on my mind was, I said, this man is lying, because a quarter of a mile is like 2 city blocks. And to call a shot on a moving target, that's almost incredible, to think of. So I got mad at first when he told me that story. Now, Shubu told me he was 98 years old. So he theoretically had one foot in the grave. I mean, and a lie really wasn't going to get him nowhere, and what was the use of him lying at that age, And so I used to walk to work about a mile every day to work from the train station to Loyola University, where I worked at that time. And Shubu told me that story on a Sunday. And so by Wednesday, I started thinking that it might be some truth, and I need to find out more of what I could find out about Bass Reeves. And I became possessed. And I've never became possessed about anything in my life, but I became possessed to find any and everything I could about Bass Reeves. And so one of the first things I did, I called up the U.S. Marshal's office in Washington, D.C., and I asked them, had they ever heard of Bass Reeves? And they said, sure, we're aware of him. He's one of the greatest lawmen we ever had in our service. And I was kind of struck by that, because here they were aware of him in D.C., but, the public wasn't aware of him. So that was kind of, and they didn't have a lot of information, but I guess just oral history in the U.S. Marshal Service, he was known to some extent. And I did contact Muskogee, Oklahoma's Historical and Genealogical Society, because I knew that Bass had lived in Muskogee the last years of his life. And I asked the woman, did they have any information on Bass Reeves? And every little town in Oklahoma has a historical or genealogical society. But anyway, the lady was very kind about it. She said, I told her, she said she had never heard of him. Then I mentioned he was an African-American deputy U.S. Marshal. And she said, sir, I'm sorry, but we do not keep Black people's history here. And I knew then my job was going to be a little harder than I initially thought. And I really started digging at that point. And one of the things that was a blessing, there was a white man named Frenterhouse, who was from Oklahoma, and he had went to the University of Oklahoma in Norman, and he had heard about a Black lawman in the Indian and Oklahoma territories as a kid growing up in Oklahoma. He didn't have a name, but he said when he went to OU, he decided to do some research, and he took a reel-to-reel tape recorder after he found out Bass Reeves' name, and he interviewed about 27 people with a 125-pound tape recorder, including Bass's daughter. And he wrote an undergraduate research paper for his history class called The Forgotten Lawman. And he took such a beating from his classmates about the paper that he He just left it in the library at OU, and it sat there for years and years. And they told me I could read it. It was very fascinating, and they said I couldn't use it unless I found him. Well, I found Richard Frenhouse, and he gave me permission to use it. But I had to go back and do a deep dive into the history of Oklahoma. I went to high school the last 2 years in Oklahoma and didn't get any history of Oklahoma. And I was kind of shocked because I had majored in African American history, and I wasn't aware that the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, and Seminole, had African slaves, chattel slaves. And that was quite interesting. So I started on a journey of trying to document the history of the Indian Territory and then trying to find out as much as I could about Bass Reeves. And I found that there was quite a few other African Americans who were deputy U.S. marshals and Indian policemen. And then I came across so many Black outlaws that I had never heard of before. And originally I wasn't going to write about Black outlaws at all because the relationship in popular media with crime and the Black community today, I was just going to leave that one alone. But I had an uncle in Oklahoma who told me that it would give some leverage to the book to include both the outlaw and the lawman. And many times the Black outlaw and lawmen were working with Native Americans in lockstep. And so I decided to include Native Americans and African Americans. And so that became the crux of my first book. And actually the publisher who published my first book pulled out 100 pages of my manuscript on the formation of the Indian Territory. And he went pretty much directly to the criminal justice aspect of the Indian Territory that I wrote about. So that was Black, Red, and Deadly, Black and Indian Gunfighters of the Indian Territory, 1870 to 1907. And being that it was pretty much frontier Oklahoma, pre-state Oklahoma, I had no idea that it was as dangerous as it was during the frontier era in Oklahoma. And I'd even come across places where Black gangs were sticking up trains. I had never had anybody say anything about Black gangs sticking up trains or, banks or those type of things. And so this is something Hollywood had totally overlooked, hadn't taken a look at. And it was very, very illuminating for me in terms of being able to find out this history. I grew up on cowboys and Indians in the 50s and the 60s. And Black people were very scarce in the depictions. And so this was like a whole new world to me, taking a look at these folks. Now, one of the things that's very interesting that there were Blacks who were lawmen in other parts of the country in the Western frontier. And so you would have found Black lawmen in Kansas and Nebraska, Montana, New Mexico, and such, but not in the numbers as you had in the Indian Oklahoma territories, except in Texas during Reconstruction. The Texas State Police from approximately 1868 to 1874, the Texas State Police was predominantly Black. And many of your white outlaws who became famous started in their careers fighting the Texas State Police. And it's very hard to get information on the Texas State Police today. There's been a book that was written, I think, the last 10 years, but it didn't get into the individuals who were members of the Texas State Police, and does mention a couple of names of the Black Texas State Police officers, but that's an area that really needs to be researched going forward. The aspect of Bass Reeves was something that really kind of knocked me over, because once I decided to do empirical research, I took trips to Oklahoma and Arkansas. But one time I went to Oklahoma on a Greyhound bus in a snowstorm, and that was quite a journey. And just did get out of a blizzard coming back home out of Oklahoma. But I had to look at newspapers. I had to look at books that were written previous to 1900. I had to look at the Indian Pioneer paper interviews that were done in 1937, 1938 with the Workers' Writers Project. That's the same project that the slave narratives in all the southern states come out of primarily. It was a deep dive I did, and when I was doing the research on Bass Reeves, I just kept shaking my head because it sounded like a cartoon character. It didn't sound like a real person. The things he was able to do, and the newspapers indicated quite clearly, because they would notate the ethnicity of people who were arrested. And Bass was arresting white people, black people, Indians who broke federal law. The court itself at Fort Smith, Arkansas was very interesting because it had jurisdiction over all the Western Arkansas and the Indian Territory. And it was about 75,000 square miles that they had jurisdiction over when Bass Reeves started in around 1875. Now, previous to that, Bass had been a slave of William Steele Reeves, who was a legislator and had a farm in Arkansas. And then William Steele Reeves, around 1846, Bass had been about 7 years old, moved to Grayson County, Texas. And William Steele Reeves placed Bass with his son, George Reeves. And George Reeves became the tax collector and the sheriff of the county in Grayson County. And Bass went with him everywhere he went. And from the stories that we have gotten, Bass was allowed to hunt and shoot. And he was such a good shot that he won competition shooting matches for his slave master. And then when the war started, Bass went with him as a body servant. And body servants were pretty much just a valet. And so he was a valet to his master going into the war. And during the war, early part, the 11th Texas Cavalry Regiment did go into the Indian Territory and did engage with Creek, Cherokee, and Seminoles who were didn't want to join up with the Confederate side at all. And the 11th Texas Cavalry Regiment did assist with pushing them into Kansas. And then they fought at the Battle of Pea Ridge. Well, from my research, I do believe that Bass was at Pea Ridge and that it was there shortly he got into an altercation with his master. Family history said it was over a card game, and Bass beat his master down. And for a slave to knock his master out was punishable by Texas law, was punishable by death. And so Bass ran into the territory. The family history said that he hooked up with Chief Opathiaholo, who was the leader of the Indians that were on the Union side. And Opathiaholo told Bass to stay in the Indian Territory and fight. And so Bass learned the lay of the land. The Indian Territory was the worst place during the Civil War for guerrilla warfare. The largest percentage loss of life, property, and livestock took place in the Indian Territory. This guerrilla warfare was pretty bad. There was a lot of irregular units, and then you had some other units, mustered in units that fought in the Indian Territory. And family history states that Bass was at the Battle of Honey Springs, which was the largest battle in the Indian Territory, where the Southern Confederate forces were crushed. Blacks played a major role in that Battle of Honey Springs. I don't know exactly what he did. I did have one old timer in Oklahoma who was 99 years old who told me that Bass was a sergeant in the Union Army during the Civil War. After the war, again, family history states that he as a guide and interpreter because he learned the Indian languages and culture while he was fighting in the Indian Territory during the Civil War. And he worked with railroad surveyors coming into the territory to lay the track for the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. After he did that, he supposedly worked as a guard for security purposes for the railroad. And then he did work for the federal office as a scout and a guide for deputy marshals working out of the Van Buren Federal Court into the Indian Territory. The Van Buren Court was moved to Fort Smith around 1872, 71, 72. And Bass did get a commission in 75. To my knowledge, Bass was never much of a farmer. He raised horses and he had a horse farm. But his job as a scout and a guide for deputy marshals and working as a posseman was the main job he had. He didn't have a job as a farmer in Arkansas too much at all. And then he built a house. He built the first house by an African American in the town of Van Buren, Arkansas. In 75, he got a commission and he began working with other deputy marshals in their crews, and then he started leading his own crews into the territory. A crew would consist of a cook, a guard, at least one posseman. You can have 2 or 3, however many you felt you needed. Bass generally took very few possemen with him. The federal government mandated you had to take at least one posseman at all times when you went into the territory. So when Bass started in 75, they would work out of Fort Smith. They worked west to Fort Sill, north to Fort Reno, and possibly sometime they go as far north as Fort Supply, which is almost to the Kansas border. And then they would come back to Fort Smith. So it'd be about 400 or 500-mile round trip. And it would take a month or 2 months, depending on high water, and because there generally was no bridges. And so you'd have to have those wagons and you go across the water. When it was low enough, the wagons could get across the water. I know a lot of Hollywood movies, including the most recent depiction, show that wagons with bars. There was no wagons with bars. They basically were supply wagons they used, and they would take 1 or 2 wagons. And the outlaws or felons they arrested while they were in the territory, they would have open warrants, and then they would have warrants with particular persons they'd be looking for. But the outlaws would be chained ankle to ankle, and they would walk. Generally, the only way they could ride in a wagon is if they were wounded. And so they would walk across the prairie, and people say it looked like a circus coming across. That went on from 1875 up until the 1890s, when they started taking away some of the land from the Fort Smith Court. I think Wichita got some parts of the Northern Cherokee Nation, and then the Paris, Texas Court got some of the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nation. But from around 75 to around 93, it was quite a deal. Bass worked in disguise. He disguised himself as a farmer. He would disguise himself as a tramp, as a preacher, as a cowboy. He worked in disguise on a regular basis. That was part of his MO. He was 6'2", about 190 pounds, and he was expert with rifle and pistol, and he could shoot with either hand. Bass Reeves was probably the greatest gunfighter in the history of the Wild West. Hands down. At the time of his death, they stated that he had killed 14 outlaws, but there were a half a dozen newspapers I found that stated he killed over 20 men in the line of duty. He did not like to brag about killing people, though he liked to brag about his detective skills, and he arrested over 3,000 felons, men and women who broke federal law. Probably was close to 4,000 people by the time he retired in 1907. And he was so famous that people, white and black, were singing songs about Bass Reeves. He was a celebrity in the Indian Territory, and is quite phenomenal due to the fact being a former slave, he couldn't read or write, and he would memorize his warrants. And generally on a trip into the territory, he would have at least 30 warrants, and he'd have somebody read the warrant off to him, and he would remember each of those warrants that he had. And if you asked him for a warrant, he could go through the stack of warrants he had and peel out the one you asked for. He had total recall, almost, phenomenal memory in terms of what he had to do. And he was very strong. I wrote about it in my book. In fact, he came across some cowboys who had a steer down in the Chickasaw Nation in some mud. And they had about 5 or 6 ropes on this steer, and they was trying to pull it out the muck and the mud, and they wasn't getting anywhere. And as the story goes, these cowboys noticed Bass got off his horse, took all his clothes off, got butt naked, jumped in this mud with this steer, and pulled all the ropes off the steer. And then he pulled and pushed the steer out of the mud with his bare strength. Uh, he was very strong. So that's what I'm saying. The stories you read about this guy, it's almost like a cartoon character almost. It's hard to believe. He escaped numerous assassination attempts. When he died, they said he was never wounded, but there is some people and in some newspapers in Indian Territory, they stated Bass had took a gunshot wound to the leg, and he walked with a cane late in his career. And supposedly he got in a gunfight in one of the saloon towns. After the Oklahoma Territory opened up in 1890, you could have saloons in the Oklahoma Territory. The Indian Territory never had saloons. But what people did, they built the saloons right up close to the Seminole and the Creek nations in the territory. And this one was really bad. It was called the Corner. And it was supposed to have been a cowboy from Texas there who challenged Bass. And Bass took a shot to the leg, but Bass killed the cowboy who challenged him. But he was quite something. And there were quite a few other African Americans who were very good deputy U.S. marshals. I actually had found where there was one black deputy as early as 1867. They called him Negro Smith, and he investigated a stagecoach driver who was murdered in the Choctaw Nation in 1867. So Bass was not the first, and actually Bynum Colbert, who was a United States Civil War veteran and served 7 years with the 10th Cav after the Civil War, he became a deputy in 1872. That was 3 years before Bass Reeves. And Bynum Colbert worked up to 1896. And he was let go for misappropriation of funds. And he was given 1 year of hard labor at Leavenworth Federal Prison. And it was quite interesting when he was taken into prison. They asked him what was his vocation. He said soldier. So I guess those years with the USCT and then the 7 years with 10th Cat and put a brand on him of his soldier. But Bynum Colbert was also the first black city policeman in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So, and did a fairly good job during his career. There were quite a few others. Grant Johnson, who was a Creek and Chickasaw freedman, he started around 1887 and worked 1896. He was very, very good. And he worked with Bass Reeves on occasion in the territory. And we haven't been able to find too many episodes of them working together. I think I have one in my book, but I know that Nudie Williams, who was a black professor at the University of Arkansas before I got involved in the research, he did some research and he talked to some folks, and they told him that the work of Bass Reeves and Grant Johnson was legendary. Johnson was African American, but he looked like a Native American. He had so many strong Native American features. So, you know, I don't know, some people talk about the whole thing about Tonto, but I don't know. But Grant Johnson did have very strong features, and him and Bass worked together for a long time. Bass worked with a lot of Native Americans, though, of the 5 tribes in the area that he primarily worked. Another outstanding lawman of that time was Dennis Cyrus, who was a Seminole freedman, and Dennis Cyrus worked years with the Seminole Light Horse Police. And then of the 25 years, 5 of them, he was a deputy U.S. Marshal for the Fort Smith Court. And he had a very good reputation in the territory and worked a long time. Quite a few of the Indian policemen in the Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation were African Americans. Actually, in the Creek Nation, they had some African Americans who were judges, and they were on both of the councils, the upper and the lower house in the Creek. And likewise with the Seminole Nation, the Seminole freemen were very involved in the politics in the Seminole Nation prior to Oklahoma statehood. There was other lawmen that I looked up, and they were quite interesting. Ike Rogers was a Cherokee freedman, and he was also a veteran of the 1st Kansas Volunteer Colored Infantry Regiment, which was a pivotal regiment during the Battle of Honey Springs, and he fought at Honey Springs also. But Ike Rogers became more famous for the capture of Cherokee Bill, who was the most famous outlaw of the Indian Territory. And Ike was later killed by Cherokee Bill's brother around 1896, 97, where he was murdered. Robert Fortune was not a freedman, but he worked in the Central District out of McAllister in the Choctaw Nation. And Robert Fortune was very good. He became a lawyer. First, he worked at the state prison at McAllister, and then became a lawyer and had a home in Chickasha in Oklahoma. And then he moved on to Phoenix, Arizona, and became one of the pillars of the Black community in Phoenix, Arizona. Robert Fortune, he had a nickname, they called him Poor Boy. Poor Boy, I don't know why they call him Poor Boy, but they call him Poor Boy. Bill Pettit was Black Deputy U.S. Marshal in Oklahoma Territory. There was a few Blacks in the Oklahoma Territory, which was formed in 1890, that became known, and Bill Pettit was one of the most well-known. He worked basically in this Osage Nation. The movie Killers of the Flower Moon is about the Osage Nation. And that was primarily the area that Bill Pettit worked in the Oklahoma Territory. And then after 1900, he got a job in Tulsa as a policeman, and he lived and died in Tulsa. Later on in life, was a big guy. He first started in Kansas, though. He worked for the federal court out of Kansas before he came down to Guthrie and worked in Guthrie. And another guy I like to talk about a lot is Barney Cleaver. And Barney had been a deputy U.S. Marshal in the Choctaw Nation. And after Oklahoma statehood, Barney Cleaver became the first Black policeman for the city of Tulsa. And when the Tulsa massacre occurred in 1921, Barney Cleaver saved that they wanted to hang. He took him out of the county jail and took him out to his farm outside of Tulsa and hid him there until things cooled down. Barney Cleaver also had a detective agency that was totally destroyed during the Tulsa massacre that occurred. And he had a big name around the city of Tulsa. He worked for the Tulsa Police Department, and then when the Tulsa massacre occurred, he was working for the Tulsa Sheriff's Office, and there was a deputy sheriff. Another person I like to talk about too, it was two Black freedmen out of the Choctaw Nation. One was Bynum, then others Bill Cobbett. Bill Cobbett was what we would call shooters. He killed quite a few people during his years in the territory. He was a posseman for a number of years for the Fort Smith Court. And then at one period, he did get a commission out of the Paris, Texas court to work over into the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw are pretty much the same, just as the Creek and the Seminole, both of them speak what is known as Muskogee. And then you have the Cherokee. So you basically have two different languages, three languages within the 5 civilized tribes. The Five civilized tribes were given that name primarily because they had adopted many of the European ways and they had embraced chattel slavery. Now, the Native Americans that would embrace chattel slavery were those who were known as mixed bloods, those who had European ancestry. And the mixed bloods political leadership eventually over all the five tribes. And there was conflict between mixed bloods and full bloods throughout the years because the full bloods tried to hold on to traditional culture and traditional ways, and the mixed bloods wanted to be more like the dominant society. And so that was a big conflict, but the federal government tended to favor mixed bloods as they did. So there was also another black Cherokee freedman named Robert Marshall. And the interesting thing is that in the Indian Territory, they had one Indian agent for all the five civilized tribes. So each tribe didn't have an agent. They had one agent who was headquartered at Muskogee. And in 1880, he formed what was known as the United States Indian Police. And so the United States Indian Police had powers to go into all the five tribes and enforce laws tribes. And they wore uniforms. And so you'd have members who were Cherokee, Seminole, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and they were members of the United States Indian Police. Most of the leadership of the United States Indian Police were also the United States Deputy Marshals. That was very common. And then many times they were also working for the railroads as railroad detectives. And the majority of train robberies that occurred in the West was in the Indian Oklahoma territories. This Hollywood hasn't covered that either. There are a lot of train robberies occurred, and you know it was quite a deal. And majority of the deputy marshals who got killed in the line of duty, the whole history of the U.S. Marshal Service died in the Indian and Oklahoma territories. Over 130, from what I can understand. And I think the U.S. Marshal Service has only lost about 230 men since inception up to the day. So it was really the killing field. And besides deputy U.S. Marshals getting killed, you had Indian police who got killed, municipal police who got killed, and such. And so it was very dangerous. Once you cross the Missouri, Kansas, Texas railroad tracks, that was called the deadline. And so you couldn't pick up a phone. I was a police commissioner for 5 years, and I know how thankful it was they could pick up a phone up. Once you crossed the deadline, there was no backup. You were on your own, and they had to go very far. Actually, the deputies couldn't pick up prisoners until they crossed the deadline, which was about 60 miles west of Fort Smith. And so they could pick them up coming back to Fort Smith, who lived between Fort Smith and the MK&T railroad tracks. So that was very interesting. So I finished that book, and I had done so much research on Blacks in the West, especially the military had a nation at that point to put together a book on African Americans who were scouts and soldiers on the Western frontier. Again, I tried to have a focus on Oklahoma as much as I could, but being that the 9th and 10th Cavalry and 24th, 25th Infantry were all over the West. And so I tried to talk about aspects of them coming to the rescue of Indians, lawmen, settlers, people. And generally, if somebody came to the rescue, it was the Buffalo Column. And also, while I was doing research, I found African Americans who were scouts. And very, very few people ever researched African Americans who were scouts. And I was almost snowballed by the fact that the greatest Army scout in the West was a Black man named Frank Garrard. And Frank Garrard was given a identity of coming from the Pacific Islands. And that was just to throw people off the fact. He had been involved in a murder as a teenager, and he was adopted by a white family in Salt Lake City. And then he went back home to the Dakotas and he fought with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And then he, I guess, decided that his best option was to go join the U.S. Army. And he walked into Fort Robertson, Nebraska, and joined the U.S. Army. And the general who was over the Army of the Plains, Northern Plains, stated that he'd give up a third of his command if he ever had to lose Frank Garrard. Frank did I don't know what he did. And then after that, he became a deputy U.S. Marshal in the Wyoming Territory. And then he carried mail. And while carrying mail, he got snow blindness and got very sick and died right after the turn of the century. But Frank Garrard is very interesting. Then I found another gentleman named Sam Bowman, who worked in the Apache Indian campaigns. He was a scout, and the Apaches trusted his interpretation of their words more than they did anybody. And Sam Bowman was killed on retired, and somebody killed him for his money that he got. And he didn't leave any memoirs because he was illiterate. But Sam Bowman worked in the Apache Indian campaign for 20 years. There's a couple of pictures of him that you can find. I wrote about James Beckwourth, who found the Beckwourth Pass between Salt Lake City and Sacramento. People had to go all the way through Southern California to go to Los Angeles and San Francisco. I bet people to go directly from Salt Lake City to Sacramento. And he had a hell of a career, a hell of a life. He lived with the Crow Indians. The Crow Indians named him a warrior chief, and he was involved in the Mexican War. And his story is quite illuminating. So if you want to read about him, I do recommend you read Black, Buckskin, and Blue, African American Scouts and Soldiers on the Western Frontier. And there's a lot of interesting stuff I have in that book, and I think people will find. And then Cherokee Bill was the most famous outlaw, and he's pretty much analogous to Billy the Kid. But Billy the Kid was not a classic outlaw. He was involved in a range war. Cherokee Bill stuck up trains, banks, and stagecoaches, and he was eventually captured, as I said earlier, by Ike Rogers, and he was executed at Fort Smith before he was 21 years of age. But he became a very famous person in that area of the Indian Territory. His mother was a Cherokee freedman, and his father was a quadroon who came out of Alabama and had joined the 10th Cav, and his mother worked there at Fort Gibson in the Cherokee Nation, and that's where Cherokee Bill's father, George Goldsby, met his mother, and they got married. And she was authenticated laundress with the 10th Cav, and they made more money than sergeants did. These black women who did clothes and wash clothes for the Army. That's a whole nother story about Cherokee Bill, but it's very interesting also. And I had to come back and do a book on Bass Reeves. People said after they read the chapter in Black, Red, and Deadly that he needed a book of his own. So I had to go back and write a book. I had to do all types of research at the National Archives. And last year, 2022, I found more information and added another chapter to that book. So of Black Gun, Silver Star. It's pretty much, it's encyclopedic almost in terms of what Bass did, but I'm still finding more information because I got contacted by a homicide detective out of Houston, Texas. And he gave me information where Bass had went to Houston, Texas in 1896, went undercover. He shadowed a man who they thought had committed a murder. Bass was waiting for 3 months during the summer of 1896 and was able to out of the man, which they used in court to convict the felon for the crime of killing a man who owned a large rooming house in Houston, Texas in 1896. But anyway, I went over a little bit of things. I can stop here and take questions if people want to ask me questions.
Yes, does anybody have any questions? You can, ask them directly, or you can type them in the chat.
If they're in the chat, when you read them, tell me.
Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
while we're waiting, one question that I do have is, um, what do you feel like the future of your research is? Will you be writing more books about Bass Reeves in the future? Are you going to concentrate on some of the men that you've just talked about?
Well, Muskogee was the wildest town in the Wild West. And so I was planning on trying to put together a book on Muskogee. Muskogee is very unique also because the population was predominantly Black. It was the largest town and had the majority of federal offices in the Indian Territory. It was in Muskogee. Blacks did not take over political leadership of Muskogee, but they were the largest part of the population. And Muskogee was never a segregated town. It was always integrated. And but it was a wild west. It was wild for 40 years. Dodge City was wild for 5. Deadwood for 5, but Muskogee was wild for 40 years. So that's what I'm working on. I write many articles for True West magazine, and if people ever read True West magazine, they will see some articles. I have 4 articles in the shoot with them that they haven't
Oh,
published.
wow.
Yeah, so those will be coming out. I just did an article also for what is it called? Wild West magazine, but they've gone to an internet magazine now. I don't know if my article, I'm gonna pull that article and give it to QS also.
Okay, so we have 2 questions that I've seen so far. James McDonough asks, what do you think of the recent TV series on Bass?
I thought it was entertaining, but it wasn't truthful. Historically, it was totally out of the loop in terms of Bass's true history. And it started in the aspect of it didn't really exist. I was really kind of displeased and disappointed that they didn't have more truth to the story. Bass never fought with the Confederate Army. During the war, he didn't live with a Seminole woman and a son for 3 years. There were no saloons in the Indian Territory as such as they showed. They had the prison wagon with the bars, and they didn't have nothing like that occurred. There was no Mr. Sundown in Indian Territory. If there had been a Mr. Sundown, he'd probably been killed real quick in Indian Territory because you lose your life real quick in Indian Territory. It was kind of good to see Bass with his family, that interaction. I kind of appreciated that, but in terms of the veracity of the story and things Bass actually did, it didn't occur. Actually, wearing a badge in Indian Territory was a sign you wanted to get killed.
Oh, wow.
Real quick. And a badge in Indian Territory at all. You wore it when you went to court, maybe, or you went in the. But once you crossed the deadline in Indian Territory, you did not wear a badge. You didn't want to tip the outlaws off that you were an outlaw, that you were law. But no, I was kind of disappointed. David Oyelowo is a great actor. I appreciate his acting, but looked like the storyline somehow got off course, and I think they could have done more due diligence in terms of putting together better and more correct storyline in terms of what Bass Reeves actually did accomplish. Yeah, one of the things, even when they thing with the cook, that's not how he shot his cook. They had him just cold-bloodedly shooting his cook. And then when the trial came up, that was not a bench trial, that was a jury trial. But they gave the focus that Judge Parker was making a determination if Bass was guilty or innocent. And that was done with a jury in Fort Smith.
Okay, another question is, was Bass also Native American?
I didn't hear you.
The other question was Bass also Native American?
No, not the majority of the blacks who were deputy U.S. Marshals were Indian freedmen. Now, Indian freedmen could have Indian blood and sometimes they didn't have Indian blood. Indian freedmen just meant you were formerly enslaved or a descendant of a former slave of the Native American. Was not a freedman. He learned the languages and the culture when he escaped into the territory during the Civil War. Bass was always notated in the census as a mulatto, and I think is quite a good possibility he could have been the slave master's child, George Steele Reeves' child.
Okay. All right, this question is from Ezekiel Easy Allen. He said, during your research, what has been the level of interaction with the Buffalo Soldiers and Negro Indian Scouts, which are both federal entities? Very little has been said in history. I assume they had to cross paths of law enforcement during westward expansion. And then he asked, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, I missed the first portion of that. Could you repeat it?
Sure. Said, during your research, what has been the level of interaction with the Buffalo Soldiers and Negro Indian Scouts, which are both federal entities? Very little has been said in history. I assume they had to cross paths of law enforcement during westward expansion.
Yeah, they did. Basically, the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts worked primarily in Texas. All the research I've seen is always in Texas. There were Buffalo Soldiers, 9th and 10th Cav, 24th, 25th Infantry that were also in Texas. And so on occasions, they did serve in certain campaigns together. And some of the Seminoles joined the regular army, I do believe, on occasion.
Mm-hmm.
That has been documented. I have a whole chapter in my book, Black, Buckskin, and Blue, on the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. And I document all their campaigns and battles they were in that book. And I also have the roster rolls of the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts in that book.
Yeah, and well, Easy was asking about their interaction with Bass Reeves, but it doesn't sound like they interacted. If they were in Southwest Texas.
Yeah, no, Bass interacted with the 9th Cav, and 10th Cav in Indian Territory, because the 9th was in Indian Territory from 1880 to around 1885. And then elements of the 10th had been there earlier, but they had elements that came back into the territory during the 80s and the early 90s. So he did interact with the Buffalo Soldiers. Actually, Bass had to go pick up prisoners from Fort Sill on occasion that the soldiers had arrested folks. Have to take them to.
Okay. Sounded like there was someone who wanted to ask a question. Mr. Benny McRae, or?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Did you want to ask a question?
Yes. Hey, Art, how you doing?
Hey.
Enjoyed your presentation.
That's Benny.
Yeah.
How you doing, Benny?
Doing okay. I have a couple questions. Were there any confrontations between Bass and Cherokee Bill?
No. During the time that Cherokee Bill was on his rampage through the territory, Bass was actually associated with the Paris, Texas court. Bass was in Paris, Texas from 93 to 97. Although he was stationed at Calvin in the Choctaw Nation, he was working primarily with that court. And then I think he worked out the Pauls Valley. They had a court there that Paris overseen. Now the family, I did talk to some family folks, and they said this went after Cherokee Bill because Bass was good friends with Cherokee Bill's mother, which, I don't know how true that is. I know there was some deputies who, like Heck Thomas, who was primarily in the Oklahoma territory at that time, who did come over and try to get the reward money on Cherokee Bill. He wasn't successful. So Bass could have probably come up to the, Cherokee Nation on a hunt for that money. Mainly the deputy marshals were bounty hunters of the Wild West. There was no independent bounty hunters like Hollywood, as he projected. And so the deputy marshals, to pad what monies they were getting, would try to find criminals who had a nice reward on their head. And Cherokee Bill had a $1,300 reward on his head, which was quite a bit of money at that time because the average salary was about $100 a year. So, you know, it was quite a few lawmen was Cherokee Bill. But no, Bass and Cherokee Bill didn't cross paths from anything I've ever seen.
Okay. What about the
He did cross paths with a lot of lawmen.
Oh yeah.
Loved to have shootouts with lawmen. I mean, he was not scared to have a gunfight at all.
Yeah. Did you'll find out where he was buried?
Who, Cherokee Bill or Bass Reeves?
No, at Bass.
Yeah, they say that the Harding Memorial Cemetery, there's a Undertaker's book that stated at Harding Memorial. That's basically behind the Walmart in Muskogee today. But I've had numerous people told me that Bass was buried at Peters Chapel Cemetery between Muskogee and Taft. Taft is that little black town west of Muskogee. And I tend to believe, it was so many people who have told me that he's buried in Peters Chapel. I tend to believe that I do Harding. They haven't found him in either one of them as yet. I don't know if they'll ever find a grave with a grave marker with his name on it.
Yeah.
Do you remember the
chapel? But
okay.
I had a question, Mr. Burton.
Yes, sir.
Did anybody from Paramount reach out to you for your extensive research on Bass Reeves and, you know, try to implement that into the story?
I had a little discussion with them way before they got started, and the discussion didn't get very far.
So I hear that there's that Morgan Freeman is actually developing a story about Bass Reeves that goes deeper into his life. Are you connected with that in any way?
Yeah, I've been working with Morgan. He hasn't been able to get a deal yet.
Right.
That's been greenlit. But yeah, I've been working with Morgan. We'll see where that goes. I do believe that Bass Reeves deserves an epic movie with some great actors. And this is this movie that just came out, Killers of the Flower Moon. There needs to be a movie on Bass Reeves of that quality, where due diligence is given to trying to tell the story as good as they can tell it.
Right.
Because it's a great story. I believe Bass is the greatest frontier hero in American history. I can't think anybody greater than Bass Reeves. He's already the U.S. Marshal Service have a new museum in Fort Smith. Has stated numerous times that Bass is the most important deputy marshal in the history of the U.S. Marshal Service.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, you can't compare Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok, any lawman of no Bass Reeves. They pale in comparison. One old guy told me, he said that Wyatt Earp couldn't be a patch on Bass Reeves' pants. Yeah, I think there's been some dramatic interpretations of Bass. Most of them have been very sad over the last 5 years that I've seen, and so I'm just waiting for one that is pretty decent. And they've put him in some dramatic shows, like the BBC had him in 80 Days Around the World. They had a Bass Reeves character, and Timeless had a Bass Reeves character at one time. That was a TV series. But I'm really waiting for somebody to really do a yeoman's job of documenting who this man really was, at least showing his character and his persona the way it should be shown.
What did you think of his depiction? And I know it was a fictional depiction, but in The Harder They Fall, what did you think of that?
Well, I think that just in terms of the personification, I think that that projection was probably the best one yet that I've seen.
Totally
Uh,
agree.
the storyline, was totally off base, but the depiction, Delroy Lindo,
Right,
I thought played a pretty good Bass Reeves in terms of, but that was a fictional story.
right.
Be good if Delroy could play a more historically correct interpretation of Bass Reeves, but I thought Delroy did a pretty good job with that.
Yeah, I was really
The
disappointed at.
rest of the movie was like a comic book, though. Yeah,
Right, right. I loved the movie for what it was and understanding that
right.
it was a work of fiction, but I was totally disappointed at the depiction of Bass Reeves and who they picked to play him in this series on Paramount.
Yeah, yeah. I could be. It's Bass was a giant back at the
Right.
time he lived because he was 6'2" and average person was about 5'6", and so he had that persona of and David Oyelowo, as great an actor he is, he just doesn't have the presence
Right.
that this big guy would have had back at that time.
Yeah. It was cringeworthy at times with um this little guy playing Bass Reeves. It was like and I
Yeah,
tried to watch it and love it, but it was some things I did like about it, but
right, right.
I
Yeah,
really, it was really, I was wondering the whole time what you, because I've been following you in your,
right.
your research, and I was always wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I was very disappointed. Seemed like they tried to place a lot of the story in Texas, where, even the ending where he was rescuing black men who were in a slave plantation type of situation. I thought, I don't know where they got that from or what the purpose of that was, where they went with that. Then they pulled some scenes that they had showed in the previews,
Oh, wow.
which was very interesting. But anyway.
Okay, I have a question here. There are two more questions that have
Yes, ma'am.
been placed in the chat. Kevin asks, can you elaborate on the Texas State Police? What was that in relation to Texas Rangers, maybe? And
Right.
two, do you know whether Reverend Haskell Shabut is related to Dal Shabut mentioned in Tia Miles' book, Ties That Bind, regarding the Cherokee? Yeah, Kevin's with good question.
Yeah. You know, and I think that she probably got the name Shubu from our research. And she said, "Oh, that sounds like an interesting name. Let me see what I can find." I don't know if that's what happened, but she did read my book before she wrote her book about the Shubus.
Mhm.
So we'll find out one day. We'll have to ask Maya about the Shubus. What was the other part of that question?
Where the connection between the Texas State Police
Yeah.
and the Texas Rangers.
Yeah, the Texas Rangers were pretty much a frontier militia unit prior to the after the Civil War. The Texas Rangers were pretty much non-existent until 1875. The aspect of African Americans as policemen got a lot of headway during Reconstruction. They were policemen in urban areas in the East and areas in the West, such as Texas. And the Texas State Police was predominantly Black. And the residents in Texas called them the End Police. It was so many Blacks on it. They did a fairly decent job, and people have never researched them the way they should due to the racism that Texas is, was part of Texas culture. So I hope somebody does some research on the Texas State Police as time goes along. But they were part of the Reconstruction politics. And then when the Texas Rangers were reconstituted in 1875, there was never a Black man on the Texas State Police until 19. And the Texas Rangers did use Blacks as Teamsters and cooks for their battalions in Texas, but they didn't have any Black men. Somebody told me there was a Black man passing for white who was a Texas Ranger, but I've never been able to document it. But the Texas State Police did a pretty good job, and they were predominantly Black in Texas at that time. Actually, another interesting story is that there in the series on Bass Reeves show his wife holding off the Klan, which that was one of the scenes they cut and didn't show in the series. Well, Arkansas had what was called the Arkansas Militia Wars in 1868, 1869. And the Arkansas State Militia was predominantly Black. And they destroyed the Ku Klux Klan in Arkansas. And Daniel Upham was the commander of the Arkansas State Militia. He was a white man who came from the East. Had been an officer, and he moved. And Daniel Upham became Bass's boss in 1876. Daniel Upham was the U.S. Marshal in Fort Smith from 1876 to, 1876 to 1880. And Daniel Upham was the guy who destroyed the Klan. And there was no Ku Klux Klan in Arkansas until 1915 when the movie Birth of the Nation came out and rejuvenated the Klan in the United States. So, you know, that scene, it's kind of good they pulled it because there was no Klan in Arkansas for Jenny Reeves to confront because the Arkansas State Militia had wiped them out.
Wow. Okay, another question from James McDonough is, in your book, he says, you emphasized Bass Reeves bringing his own son to justice as a reflection of his character. Can you expound on that event?
Right. Bass pretty much always went by the letter of the law. He didn't show any favors to anybody. If you broke the law, you had to, pay the son we love and lived in a house with him for a while. You know, he lived with Winnie, his second wife, in Muskogee. He got married, and in 1902, his wife was unfaithful, and I guess he was so jealous, he killed her. He shot her in the head and killed her. She was a freedman, Creek freedman. But the warrant went out for Benny, and Bass did not want any other deputy marshal getting hurt, bringing his son in. So he told me, "Oh, Bennett, give me the warrant. I'll bring him in." And so Benny was there in Muskogee, in a part of town. Bass didn't leave town going on no 2-week search for Benny or nothing like that, like some people have tried to say he did. So Bass went to the neighborhood where Benny was, and he told Benny to come on and, don't put up any fight because I don't want to have to kill you. And so Bass arrested Benny in 1902. Benny was convicted for first-degree murder and was sent to the Leavenworth Federal Prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. He was given a life sentence, but he only served 11 years. And he was paroled out and went back to Muskogee and lived the rest of his life. Bass also arrested his minister who baptized him in 1907 for selling bootleg whiskey. The church had gotten behind in arrears, and the congregation told the pastor he could sell some bootleg whiskey. And Bass arrested him. And that was the pastor that had baptized Bass.
Wow.
So Bass didn't, if he got the warrant or whatever, he was going to. Actually, if Bass got the warrant for your arrest, your best deal was to try to leave the territory the best you could. Because if you tried to hide, he would find you. If you tried to run, he would catch you. If you tried to have a gunfight with him, it was tantamount to commit suicide. He was the real deal.
Mr. Burton, I have a theory really, and I want to get your opinion on it because it seems like most of the stories I hear about Black cowboys and the research, I haven't seen any direct literature on it, but it seems like most of the like after the Civil War, a lot of the Confederate soldiers, most of them became outlaws. And it seems like it was mostly like the Black Seminole Scouts and the Black lawmen that was actually really cleaning up the West, as they say.
Well, I understand what you're saying. It was a lot of the outlaws were former Confederates or, from the South. I would probably say it wasn't the military. It was the Buffalo Soldiers who did arrest a lot of felons themselves, or people that were, they had to go in and deal with a lot of situations where they brought peace to the scenario. They handled range wars. They did a lot. They did more. They did more than people realize. The 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th, 25th Infantry Regiments. They the ones who really, I think, brought settlement to the Western frontier. And they were all over the West. They were in the Dakotas, they were in Montana, they was in Washington, they was in California, they were in Utah, they were everywhere, Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma. They were all a great, great job. They didn't just fight Indians. They were saving Indians on some occasions. And they saved other white soldiers. I mean, they did so much, man. You have to read my book, Black, Buckskin, and Blue, so you can get a great feel for what the Buffalo Soldiers did.
I'm ordering it today.
Great. Actually, I had an uncle. I never met him, but in 1916, he was in the 10th, and he went after Pancho Villa in Mexico. They didn't catch Pancho Villa, but he had an uncle that had Pancho Villa.
Wow.
Do we have another hand up? Look like I seen somebody. Okay.
Mr. Burton,
Yes.
how you doing, sir? I'm really impressed with your briefing. My name is Carlos Lobo Bezan. I am from Arizona.
Oh, how you doing, Carlos?
Pretty good. I am involved with the 9th, the 10th, the 24th, the 25th. I'm involved with Camp Naco, which is a Buffalo Soldier camp right here in Arizona. Columbus, New Mexico, which is where Pancho Villa invaded that little town back in 1916, back in March 16th or thereabouts.
Right.
I'm involved with Daryl Nash, a historian up in Washington State. I've got a ranger, Roger Osorio from New York. He did a beautiful presentation of Fort Niagara in New York on Buffalo Soldiers, where the 24th was garrisoned.
Right.
I've got a Buffalo Soldier, not a Buffalo Soldier, another historian from the NPS in Ohio. I've got another one in Texas. I've got, I don't know if you know John Langolier. He's another author.
Yeah, I know John
Mr.
very
Leckie.
Well. Yeah.
Mr. Leckie, and on and on and on. I am I'm retired military.
Okay.
And also retired federal service. And I am very, very deeply involved with the Buffalo Soldier history in Arizona and all along the borders. We've got Camp Naco, Camp Little, Arivaca, the Harvey Jones, which is just literally a little dirt in a little corner lot somewhere that's left.
Right.
We've got the Camp Bonita. We've got a lot of places here in Arizona. Camp Verde. We got Tombstone. They were there. Fort Lowell. They were there. Yeah, you're right about the Buffalo Soldiers. They are all the way literally from Vermont all the way clean through Alaska.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah, and all the way from, and I think they might have even, and I'm not sure yet.
There's been a book on. Okay.
Huh?
I said, go ahead.
Oh, and I would not doubt it if they didn't cross into Canada at some point or another, because they did go 500 and some odd miles into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa.
Right. Right.
The unique thing about the Pancho Villa expedition that they did with Blackjack Pershing is that there was a transition there between horses and into using trucks, aircraft, cannons, machine guns, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Machine guns were being used too at that time.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I haven't seen a book on Buffalo Soldiers in Arizona yet. I know there was one on Buffalo Soldiers in New Mexico, but yes, it's there's two towns I believe that was started by Buffalo Soldiers in Arizona, where once they retired, they started towns in Arizona. But yeah, it's a fascinating history. I appreciate it. You know, one of my heroes growing up was Elfego Baca, who was involved in Mexico, and a very famous gentleman. If you're not familiar with him, I definitely should look him up. Elfego Baca, Baca. Yeah, he was a very famous lawman in New Mexico.
I also found two Seminole trackers or Buffalo Soldiers here. We have one in Bisbee and one in Douglas. Asa Ross is in Bisbee, and Pompey Long is in Douglas.
Oh, okay.
I got the information. I need to send it to Wendy, so you guys can put it on your website or whatever you need to do. I've got the grave sites, the cemetery they're at. I will be going to find Pompey Long's place of rest here in the next couple of days.
Very good. Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir. Any other
Okay, do
questions?
we have any other? Yeah, I was just gonna ask the same thing.
Can I say something?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I do history, and whenever there's a movie, historians will tell you it's terrible because it usually is. And the only thing that's positive about it is it might get somebody thinking about the subject and looking something up.
Mm.
You know, like the Napoleon movie. I mean, I'm not even going to go see it because everybody says it's just. But maybe somebody who doesn't know anything at all about Napoleon will reach out and get a book.
Right. Right.
You know, so there's that.
Yeah.
And what's that movie with Alan Alda? You know, from MASH. He did a movie about making a movie about a book on American history by a professor.
Mm.
He writes this book about the American Revolution, and they're going to make a movie out of it. And the movie is actually about making the movie. And everything is wrong. And you know, he's having fits and whatnot, you know, but it does tell you something about how movies are made.
Right. Right. Yeah, if you want to get your history, Hollywood is not a good place to do it.
Yeah. That was very good.
Yeah.
That's a very good point, Dr. Al. You know, hopefully this has created a whole new interest in Bass, and people are running out to buy books so that they can get a deeper understanding. Maybe there were things that they saw that said, that doesn't make sense. You know, let me go see if this is really true. So hopefully, that's what we could hope, is that it's spurring on this next generation of people who are going to learn about him and want to really learn the truth, you know? So that's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the areas of interest is the Indian Wars. I mean, that's another subject you can spend 2 hours talking about. That was the most costly Indian War for the United States government. A lot of people don't know that, but it's a fascinating story.
Which one? I'm sorry, I missed it.
The Seminole Indian War.
Yeah, the Second Seminole War in particular. Yeah.
This is a subject, the Second Seminole War, and like primarily I've been researching that for about 7 years and writing a screenplay to tell this story. Yeah. And just like you said, it's you want to learn history, Hollywood is really not where you want to go, but I think it's because we really haven't been allowed to tell our own stories.
Right.
And this is something I've been obsessed with, this story, and particularly John Horse.
Yeah, the great James Beckworth was involved in the Seminole War, and he couldn't take it. He left. He said it's too much for him.
Wow.
Yeah.
He's a good example of what Hollywood does to people.
Right.
There's a movie in which it's about James Beckworth, except that he's a white guy.
Wow.
Yeah, they had a white man playing it.
30s or 40s.
Right.
and it's supposedly, and you know, it's James Beckworth. The name is used and everything, you know, and it has all these adventures and stuff. It's a white guy.
Yeah, yeah. That you know that yeah that happens. They had a Cherokee Bill story on TV back in the 50s and had a Native American playing Cherokee Bill, but Cherokee Bill was black with nappy hair. So no, Hollywood.
Are they still making this stuff about Cherokee Bill being a Sioux Indian?
No, 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 no. No, I haven't seen nobody go there no more. But you know, so hopefully my book has helped clear some of that up, Benny. Yeah, his daddy
Yeah,
has stated
yeah.
that because he was married to a white woman and he was trying to throw people off in terms of who he really was. Said he was
I first read it in Lucky's book.
right,
That's what in fact that's what got me involved in
right,
research, and that goes with family. He was born in Selma, Alabama, supposedly where he was born in that area,
right.
but his ancestors were Caucasian, Sioux Indian, and Mexican. And of course, you know,
Yeah,
we found out later that that's not true at
yeah,
all.
exactly, exactly. Now that wasn't true at all. Yeah, um, that's an interesting story. If that would be a hell of a movie if somebody ever did one on the Goldsby family, starting with Cherokee Bill's father, bringing it up through his life, you know, up to the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
That would be a hell of a movie. If anybody
What
ever,
happened? What happened to the book that the Goldsby family is supposed to be writing?
I'm sorry.
The book that they're supposed to be writing a book on his life on George Goldsby.
Yeah, I'm not aware. I'm not aware of that.
I thought Desi Preston, that's one of his relatives.
Right.
He knows you. She
Yeah,
talks about you all the time.
right. She didn't get back to me on that. I haven't heard from her in quite a while.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah. But you know, I did go to Gettysburg and George Goldsby, Cherokee Bill's father, was at Gettysburg. And
He was at
I had
Appomattox.
friends there at Gettysburg. Now I was at Gettysburg. I was at Gettysburg. And I asked him when Robert E. Lee came to Gettysburg, how many black laborers were with the Army of Northern Virginia. And they said somewhere in the area, 100,000 slaves were with Robert E. Lee when he invaded Pennsylvania. That just blew me away. I had no idea that the Confederate Army had that many laborers.
Yeah.
Well, that number's a little high, but they had
And
a
cooks and
huge.
them going into Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Yes, it was 100. Well, no, it wasn't 100,000. It was 10,000. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Now, excuse me, I said 100,000. It was 10,000 black laborers were with the Army in Northern Virginia.
Okay.
Well,
Did
one of the drivers of the Emancipation Proclamation is that the Confederate Army is using huge numbers of black slaves and
Right.
free black people too. They're just dragging them and, you know,
Right.
to do construction and all this other stuff. And if we can encourage these people to run away, this will weaken the Confederate Army and at the same time strengthen the Union Army.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what Lincoln's idea was.
Yeah.
Well, that's what happened at Fort Monroe in '61 when Butler refused to return those slaves back to the Confederacy.
Right.
That's what started it all. In fact, there's an excellent article in the New York Times written in 2011 how slavery really ended in America. And it's about that incident that happened with Butler and those 3 slaves that escaped. So that happened throughout the Civil War, you know,
Right.
because
Right.
the Confederate would impress thousands of blacks as laborers, and of course their owners were paid, and a lot of those guys escaped and went to the Union Army and served it well in contrabands in the Union Army. So, and
Right.
it weakened the Confederate Army greatly, you know,
Right.
from that standpoint.
I don't know if everybody know Benny, who just was speaking. Benny's one of the most knowledgeable people on the Civil War I ever met in my life, and he's schooled me so much on the aspects, especially blacks in the Civil War, and I really appreciate everything he's done to help educate folks on that history.
I don't know about being the most knowledgeable, but
I didn't say you
know
was
a
most.
little bit.
You say you was one of the most knowledgeable, Benny.
Okay, 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 all right, thank you. Yeah. But speaking of Gettysburg,
The Wild West is actually an extension of the Civil War to a great extent. The young man Lamont had mentioned about the Civil War, and it was a lot of things that carried over to the Wild West from the Civil War that did
yeah,
occur. Yeah,
Well, a lot of the violence in the West, you know, they didn't know anything about PTSD in those days.
right, right.
yeah, yeah,
And young men drifting west, you know, you could see your, you know, former soldiers who couldn't handle some issues.
Yeah, from what I've heard, I think that's a little bit from PTSD, because the family said that he didn't like people standing in the doorway, and he would curse in his sleep a lot. I think he had some trauma from the Civil War.
Who was that?
Bass Reeves did.
Oh, Bass. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
Now,
Do you know how many cells were in that jail at Fort Smith? Or
the original jail at Fort Smith only had 2 large holding cells under the court. Now, when they
this was, I mean, in the basement,
renovated
the cells.
it, I don't know how many cells. They had two. They had 2 rows. They had two floors of cells.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I don't know. I can find out though.
Yeah, I've been there, and of course they've cleaned that area out. And the park ranger, she tried to show me with the cell that Cherokee Bill was in when he was there, you know. And I was just wondering how many people did they have in that basement of that jail at that time.
Yeah. Well, Cherokee Bill was in the new jail structure they had. I think he
Oh,
was
is
on the
that right?
second floor. Yeah, he was on the second floor of the jail. They had 2 rows on each side. I would imagine they had at least 10, 20 cells.
Okay, okay,
At least.
okay.
If they didn't
You know, he
have
had
more.
that. Did they ever find out who gave him that pistol and that bucket of lime that where he shot the jail up?
No,
Did they ever find out?
they didn't. They had an idea who did it, but they never proved. They think it was a black man who was incarcerated there.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, that got the shells to Cherokee Bill and the gun.
I think he killed a jailer, didn't he?
Yeah, he did kill a jailer. While he said he really hated to do it, but he had to fight for his freedom. I think if he was probably successful with the jailbreak, he'd probably been much bigger in history, because that really made Billy the Kid famous, was the fact that he was able to escape from jail. Cherokee Bill gave it a good try, but he wasn't successful.
Yeah. Wow. And of course, they had a new trial, and Judge Isaac Parker sentenced him to hang the second time around. Is that right?
Say what? I'm sorry.
I think he had 2 death penalties against him. Is that correct?
Okay, you're breaking up. I'm sorry.
I say I think he had 2 death penalties against him when he shot the jail up, shot up in the jail. Is that correct?
Yeah, he had one for sure.
One.
It was the killing that he had done up in northern Cherokee Nation.
Right.
And then when he killed the guard, they just doubled up. They just, time for him to go. But they
Okay. Okay.
said he had good possibility of off on that first murder charge. The attorney thought.
Okay.
So, it was kind of
Okay.
providence. But he had done so much damage. And
Okay.
it was probably good he went on and had to leave because he had killed so many people anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah.
he was
Yeah.
definitely homicidal.
Yeah. I got one more question on his dad, George. George ended up in Harrisburg during the Civil War. Did he
Right. During the Civil War.
desert after Gettysburg, or did he desert after Gettysburg?
Yeah, George was a paid teamster for the Confederate Army going into Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And at
Right.
Gettysburg, he decided to go over to the Union side. So he left the Confederates at Gettysburg. And and eventually wound up joining Confederate cavalry unit in Pennsylvania.
No, Union cavalry.
Yeah,
the 21st Pennsylvania Company E of the 21st Pennsylvania cavalry. Yeah, right.
And he rose to the rank of corporal in that
right.
unit. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So that says a lot, And a lot of the guys after the war, they were interviewed and they said they didn't feel he was really white, which I thought was
Yeah, right. Well, I didn't know a thing about the history of the Western frontier until I met you, Art, in Chicago, and I guess you remember that, don't you?
Yeah, well,
you and Angela,
right,
taught me everything I knew. I
learned a lot from you too, Benny.
Okay.
We traded on that one.
Okay.
All right. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you also.
Thank you.
Well, it looks like that's all of the questions that everybody has.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed it, Wendy, and you can have me back sometime. Or Western history. I'd be glad to do it.
Yes, definitely. Yes. I will definitely take you up on the offer. I think this has been an amazing presentation. Looks like does James have another question? I don't know. He's waving. I don't know what that means.
I had a question, Wendy.
Okay, yes.
I want to get the opinion on that movie called Emancipation that starred Will Smith in 2022. Decently historically accurate or not?
Did you hear the question, Mr. Burton?
I think the story is loosely based on a real incident. I thought it was okay. I'll put it like that. He was in the mud and the dirt, and then my wife went to the movie theater with me, and she noticed right away that his fingernails were manicured.
Yeah.
And that threw me for a loop. I think it could have been a better picture. Well, it's a great promise, but it's I give it a C plus. But I thought initially years ago I thought Will might could play Bass Reeves, but I don't think he would. Yeah, Kevin has a hand up too, Wendy.
Yeah, I thought I had seen Kevin.
All right.
Hey, Kevin, did you want to ask your question?
No, that was clapping. Good answer.
Oh,
Thank you.
See, I don't know what the Zoom symbols mean. But yeah, I just want to say again, thank you.
You're welcome, Wendy. My pleasure.
Yeah, and I think we'll definitely all stay in touch, especially, your relationship with Mr. Benny McRae is so important. And,
right.
It's a symbiotic relationship, it seems. And, we are the recipients of the knowledge that y'all are sharing with us. So we're so grateful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, everybody have a great holiday season.
Yes.
And
you too. You too.
Those who haven't read, please read my books.
I am
Yeah, we might have
definitely
to do a book
ordering.
club.
What-
Yeah, we might have to do a book club or something.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be
Mr.
great.
Burton, which one did you recommend about the Buffalo Soldiers? I forgot the title you said.
Black, buckskin, and blue.
Okay, I see it.
Right. Can't go wrong.
What's your next one, book?
I'd like to
next book?
I'd like to reach out to you at some point and pick your brain on this, the Seminole story.
Okay. Be glad to.
Okay.
Be glad to. Yeah, Muskogee, Benny. I'm gonna try to do one on the Muskogee, the Wild West town of Muskogee, Creek Nation Indian Territory.
I got one more question. Is Slick Barbecue still open? In
No,
Muskogee?
Slick died over 2 years ago, Benny. And yeah, nobody took his barbecue place. Billy Sims,
Oh, wow.
former Oklahoma football player, he has a place in Muskogee now. But he has a whole chain of barbecue joints in Oklahoma. Billy Sims.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can order it on the internet too, Billy Sims.
Oh, wow.
Barbecue. It's pretty good.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Slick was pretty unique place, I thought.
On a whole nother level of barbecue. And
Yeah.
and he only put it on wax paper, but it was probably some of the best barbecue ever made.
Yeah.
In the United States. Slick.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank y'all so much.
All right. Y'all take care.
Everybody have a great night.
Everybody,
Right.
and thank you. This was a blessing.
Yeah,
I'm blessed to be a part of this. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you.